They beat the widow every morning just after the church bell rang, because pain was easier to hide when the town pretended not to see it, and Sarah Whitmore had learned that silence was the price of survival the day her husband was lowered into the red Wyoming dirt with no headstone and no prayers spoken loud enough to matter. She was only 26, her hands already rough like an old woman's, her back bent from carrying grief in buckets of water. She was never paid enough to haul, and every dawn the Miller brothers waited for her outside the boarding house where she scrubbed floors in exchange for a corner, bed and stale bread. They said it was for unpaid debts, for disrespect, for breathing wrong, but the truth was simpler. A widow had no shield. Her black dress had long faded to gray. Bruises bloomed beneath the fabric like secrets she kept for the town's comfort. And when she walked the dusty main road with her eyes downcast, people whispered but never stopped. The Millers were respected cattlemen, violent only when no one important was watching, and Sarah learned to count blows instead of days, to focus on the sound of boots hitting dirt, rather than the pain that followed, because crying only made them laugh. Her husband Thomas had died in a stable accident, crushed by a panicked horse, and with him went her name, her protection, and the small patch of land they had been promised but never granted, because contracts written by powerful men could always be lost. On every night she washed blood from her sleeves in cold water, whispering apologies to a God who seemed to have misplaced her prayers. And every morning she returned to work because hunger was crueler than fear. Then one morning the beating stopped, not because the Millers had found mercy, but because a horse the color of storm clouds stood in the road, blocking their path, ridden by a man whose shadow alone was enough to quiet the street. Elias Crow had returned to town, the richest rancher in 3 counties, a man spoken of in legends and warnings, a widower himself whose wealth came from land wrestled from drought and rivals alike, and whose eyes were said to see through lies the way knives slid through cloth. He dismounted slowly, his boots clean, his coat unwrinkled, his presence bending the air, and when he looked at Sarah, he did not see a widow or a burden, but something older, something broken that still stood upright. The Millers tried to laugh it off, muttered excuses, but Elias's voice cut through them, calm and cold, telling them to leave her alone, telling them that this road, this woman, this moment now belonged to him. They backed away not because of law, but because money and reputation were louder than fists. Sarah expected him to leave then, expected nothing more than a pause in cruelty. But instead he offered her a handkerchief for the blood at her lip and said, quietly enough that only she could hear, "You shouldn't be here." She didn't understand what he meant, until later that night, when a carriage stopped outside the boarding house and Elias Crow himself stepped down, walked inside, and announced to a stunned room that he intended to marry Sarah Whitmore. Gasps filled the air like smoke. Some laughed. Some scoffed. The boarding house owner crossed herself. A rich rancher marrying a beaten widow made no sense, not to a town built on hierarchy and cruelty, and when Sarah was pulled aside and asked if she'd bewitched him, she could only shake her head, because she was more afraid of hope than pain. Elias spoke to her alone by lantern light, his voice steady, his eyes unreadable, telling her the marriage would protect her, that no one would touch her again, that she would have a home, food, safety, and nothing more would be asked of her than silence. She asked him why. He didn't answer. He only said the wedding would be in 3 days. That night Sarah lay awake listening to her heart pound, wondering what kind of man married a woman everyone else had broken, and what kind of reason could be worth binding 2 wounded lives together. If this story already has you holding your breath, remember to subscribe, because what comes next will change everything you think you know about power, revenge, and the cost of mercy. The wedding was small, quiet, and sharp with tension, held under a cloudless sky that felt like judgment rather than blessing, and Sarah walked beside Elias Crow with her head high, not because she felt brave, but because she knew this was the last chance she had to escape the life that had been carved into her skin. The town watched with disbelief as vows were spoken without romance, hands joined without warmth, and when Elias led her away to his ranch, the silence between them was heavier than the gold people imagined lay in his vaults. Days passed, then weeks, and Elias kept his word. No one harmed her, no one raised a voice to her, and she was given her own room, her own space, her own dignity, yet something felt wrong. because protection without kindness felt like a cage made of silk. He was distant but not cruel, present but unreachable, spending long hours riding the perimeter of his land, studying ledgers, meeting with men who looked nervous in his presence, and slowly, Sarah began to notice patterns. The Miller brothers avoiding the road near the ranch, whispers of debts being called in, contracts reviewed, past crimes resurfacing. Elias wasn't just rich. He was patient, and one night, when thunder rolled across the plains and memories clawed at her chest, Sarah finally demanded the truth. Elias sat across from her in the firelight and told her everything. Years ago, his younger sister had married a man from this town, a gentle woman broken by daily cruelty while everyone looked away, beaten until she died from an accident no one questioned. And Elias had learned too late that wealth without witnesses meant nothing. The Millers had been involved. So had the sheriff. So had men who smiled at church and spat at widows in alleys. Elias didn't marry Sarah out of pity. He married her to expose them. As his wife, she was untouchable, visible, powerful in a way no widow ever was, and every bruise she once carried became evidence in a larger reckoning. Over months, Elias gathered testimonies, forced confessions through financial pressure, brought federal marshals into town under the guise of cattle deals, and when the arrests came, they came fast and brutal, dragging respected men into the open where the town could no longer pretend. The Millers were jailed. The sheriff fled. The boarding house owner cried. And when it was over, Elias stood before Sarah and told her she was free, that the marriage had served its purpose, that she could leave with money, land, and a new name if she wished. Sarah looked at him then, not as a savior or a tyrant, but as a man who had used pain to punish pain, and she realized something neither of them expected. She had found her strength not in protection, but in being seen. She chose to stay not because she owed him, but because she wanted to build something honest from the ashes of cruelty. Together they opened their land to women with nowhere to go, hired widows, fed children no one claimed, and the ranch became a quiet rebellion against the town it once feared. Elias never asked for forgiveness. Sarah never asked for love. Yet over time something gentler grew between them, not a fairy tale, but a partnership forged in truth. And when people asked why the rich rancher married a beaten widow, the answer was never spoken aloud, because the real reason was written in changed lives, in justice delayed but delivered, and in a woman who refused to stay invisible. If this story moved you, inspired you, or made you see strength differently, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, because stories like this remind us that even in the darkest places, courage can still rewrite fate.